You're listening to Apologetics Profile.
In 1818, Jane Austen published Northanger Abbey. The main character, a vibrant but somewhat naive young woman named Catherine Morland, enjoys reading Gothic novels, a popular genre in Jane Austen's day that included dark and foreboding landscapes, castles, suspense, skeletons, terror, and a mystery or two. In Northanger, Morland has the opportunity to stay with friends at an old abbey, a medieval dormitory for monks or nuns that had been renovated for a private residence. As she explores the enchantingly mysterious grounds, her imagination, fueled by her love of Gothic novels, gets the best of her. She starts to think that she is in a Gothic novel, and that perhaps her host, General Tilney, has murdered his wife. Alone one stormy night in her bedroom, she begins exploring a large ebony cabinet, searching for clues to the murder she assumes has taken place. Quote, Catherine's heart beat quick, but her courage did not fail her. With a cheek flushed by hope and an eye straining with curiosity, her fingers grasped the handle of a drawer and drew it forth. It was empty. With less alarm and greater eagerness, she seized a second, a third, a fourth. Each was equally empty. Not one was left unsearched, and in not one was anything found. Well read in the art of concealing a treasure, the possibility of false linings to the drawers did not escape her, and she felt round each with anxious acuteness in vain. End quote. Northanger Abbey is Austen's playful spoof on the Gothic novel genre, but in not a few ways perhaps we can compare the Gothic novel of Jane Austen's day to the body of literature of the latter part of the 19th century known as the Religionsgeschichtliche school of German higher criticism. The dark and baleful influence of this particular genre cast a foreboding shadow over the imaginations of 20th century liberal scholars and critics of the Bible, just as the Gothic novels excitedly stirred and deceived young Catherine Morland's mind to go looking for things that simply were not there. For over a dark and stormy century now, however, the liberal critics rifling through the broodingly mysterious bureaus of naturalism in search of a naturalistic hypothesis for Jesus' resurrection has turned up empty. When General Tilney's son Henry finds out about Catherine's ridiculous suspicions that his mother had been murdered by his father, he confronts her squarely. Quote, Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observations of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetuated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighborhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been entertaining? End quote. Henry Tilney's exhortations to Catherine could also serve well in asking skeptics about how their dreadful naturalistic suspicions about Jesus' resurrection might have been pulled off in and around first century Jerusalem. This week in Next on Apologetics Profile, we will be chatting with the world's leading scholar on the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, Dr. Gary Habermas. Last year, we talked with Gary about Volume 1, and this go-around, we will be discussing a few topics he covers in Volume 2, which goes into extensive detail, critiquing just about every scholarly and popular level naturalistic objection to Jesus rising from the dead in existence today. Volume 2 came out last fall and is over 800 pages in length, with extensive annotation and documentation of source materials. Here, Gary gives us a brief overview of what will eventually be a 4-volume compendium of his life's work and research.
It's part of a 4-volume set. One came out last year, January. 2 came out in September. 3 is due right now. It's due, this week. And 4 doesn't come out for a year. It just finished the editing on 4. So they all hang together. 1 says there's good evidence. 2 says there's no good counter evidence for it. 3, we leave the subject of apologetics and we go to critical views of all kinds. Christian scholar, you have to be a scholar to make it into this roll call. But so you have a terminal degree in a relevant field. If you're Christian, welcome. You're not a Christian, welcome. Maybe you don't believe I'm saying that. We have atheist New Testament scholars, agnostic New Testament scholars, non-Christian, in other words, Jewish or other kinds of religions who say things about Jesus. And we're citing what do they allow about the data from history. We don't if I don't agree with their view, I don't dispute it. We just leave the quotations or the summaries. A lot of them we have to summarize because fair use legally, you can only cite so many words. So someone's going to say, why don't you let his own words stand? I had to decide which ones to paraphrase and which ones to quote. But there's a whole lot of quotations, and I just let them sit. People probably won't be able to believe that as a Christian, I'm just going to let these horrible heretical views to just sit there. But what I'm trying to say is there's a wide agreement on the facts pertaining to the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I use 12 facts, then I shrink the list from 12 to 6. It's those 6 that I call the minimal facts. And one thing Volume 3 does is it tells you how widespread is the belief in Volume 3, even from people that aren't close to Christianity.
Since the Catholic Church has elected a new pope recently, an American-born and raised in Chicago, I thought it was fitting to discuss how appearances or apparitions of the Virgin Mary are sometimes used by skeptics to try and cast doubt on the resurrection of Jesus. Apparitions are defined as, quote, the sudden appearance of a supernatural entity which directly manifests itself to a human individual or group, end quote. Marian apparitions by themselves don't show Catholicism or Christianity to be true by any means, but they certainly make theism much more plausible than atheism or naturalism.
Why do skeptics who want to push hallucination, why do they use Marian apparitions, to my knowledge, more than any other kind of example, because they're groups? And they think, oh, that's like Paul. That's like the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15. What's wrong with me saying, okay, time out. I'm a Christian. They say they're Christians. I'm not going to judge their Christianity. But what you're saying to me is, if worst comes to worst, these aren't devil worshipers. These aren't another religion. These are people who name the name of Christ, who say, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I won't question their theology. That's not what we're doing here. But I'm saying, why do why are all the examples, why are by far the most examples from Marian apparitions? Why would an atheist or an agnostic or a skeptic who wants to say there's no miracles in the world and say tens of thousands of people saw Mary? I mean, are you conceding Christianity? No. Okay, are you conceding Catholic Christianity? No. Do you think anything happened with Marian apparitions if you're a skeptic or an atheist? No. Then why did you bring these up? Well, I don't think they're happening, but that could have been what happened with Jesus. Really? On what grounds do you think they didn't happen? If you answer your own question, why don't you believe Jesus, the Son of God, died on the cross for your sins and rose from the dead? If your example is a Christian example, then why aren't you a Christian? Oh, because I think they're all mistaken. But they're your best example, and you just think that represents your theory really, really well. But you're just going to popularly say, I'm going to use this data, but I don't believe any of the data. If you don't believe the data, don't use the silly example. If it's a silly example to you, but if it's a silly example to you, why do you use it for your theory? Why does your theory have to cross the fence to invite a worldview that you detest, possibly, and that you reject? And you want me to see that that's the best explanation for my supernatural appearance to the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15. I think the analogy is wrong. I think you haven't proven those experiences are false. Now you got two problems. You've got to use this faulty data that you don't agree with. But secondly, you have to play philosopher now, and you've got to make an inference from if Mary, then Jesus. And you don't even know the if Mary. In fact, you don't even agree with the if Mary, but you're going to say, then Jesus, and they're both fake. What I'm saying is there's a string of inferences here that don't follow from the data or the way you're using the data.
Line drive, base hit to right field. One hop to Parra. Myers in to score. The throw to first. Got him at first.
Parra throws him out. How about that?
Gerardo Parra throws out Paddock at first base. No base hit. No run.
Here I ask Gary to comment on the often repeated phrase by skeptics that any natural explanation is better than a purported miracle.
Let's use the baseball illustration. Not counting hitting a home run. If you don't get to first, you can't get to second. Well, you can get a double. Okay, good. But you have to make it in an orderly manner. And if you get thrown out before you get to the next base, what you're doing is saying, we scored 9 runs in that inning, and our guys ran the bases, and we covered 22 total bases in that inning. You have to take your logic and string that out every single time, and you've got to get them to each base if you're going to make a logical argument. I'm saying the logic breaks down at any of those places between home and first, between first and second, between second and third, between third and home. And I hear people say this in lectures, and they'll say, it could have happened that way. I may be right here. I wasn't there. I don't know. But you weren't there either. It could have been. So now your first to second to third to fourth is a string of maybes. I want data.
I'm glad you established that, because out of that, Gary, you have a quote on page 161 in your book. It's a challenge, the category 4, historical a priori objections to miracle claims. And so out of this naturalistic worldview, we have a cadre of people who are New Testament historians, New Testament critics. But you say here that, and this is not what you believe, this is what you're saying the challenge is, and you hear this a lot from New Testament scholars who are liberal, historians cannot investigate miracle claims because they simply do not possess any tools that allow them to test for the presence of God or divine activity in the world. And so somebody like, all the liberal historians that you've collected in your book, but basically it's like, well, the resurrection is a religious question that history can't touch. But it seems to me that if the Christian faith is true, it is making significant historical claims. And so you see that these skeptics try to draw a line of demarcation between religion and history, and then they'll say, well, I'm a historian, I'm a New Testament critic. What do you know about these things? But naturalism does not give them the foundation to be able to draw a line between history and the resurrection.
Yeah, I would say really simply, if they cannot show that something like naturalism or materialism or naturalistic materialism, if they can't show that that view is true, don't try to throw it up in my face with an assumption, something like, all scientists say it's true, or all my friends say it's true, or I've always believed it's true. You should believe it's true. That's wonderful. None of those are arguments. And if you're a modern person with a PhD from Harvard or somebody like that, you should believe it's true too. Anymore, that makes me question whether it's false. From what I've been hearing in the news about certain schools, I wonder what they're teaching. But what you can't do, as far as I understand, you're not claiming to prove naturalism. You're not claiming to prove materialism, but you're using the lack of proof to assume a proof to say that whatever evidence I have must be false because your backdrop is true. By the way, later in that book, I have 5 problems with naturalism, 5 problems with naturalistic theories as a whole. And we start by saying the backdrop created by David Hume and company. And I have 2 large sections in that book, one about what did David Hume do and what's wrong, and one what did way more sophisticated arguments than David Hume, what do they do? And I have, on those 2 alone, I have 131 pages, 2 chapters on Hume and on post-Hume tightening the screws down, making Hume tougher. But what they don't do is prove naturalism's true.
Gary argues that the foundational issue isn't whether or not miracles are possible, but about first establishing the truth of naturalism. Naturalism does indeed, in various forms, attempt to offer answers to some of life's bigger questions about God. He likely doesn't exist. About the afterlife, it makes no sense to believe in it. And our place in the cosmos. We came from supernova and have to forge our own meaning in an otherwise meaningless universe. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga argues that naturalism actually undermines our ability to trust our thinking and reasoning. Plantinga notes that the real conflict isn't between science and Christianity, but between science and naturalism. He says, quote, "The basic argument could be put, a bit crudely, as follows. First, the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. To put it a bit inaccurately but suggestively, if naturalism and evolution were both true, our cognitive faculties would very likely not be reliable. But then, according to the second premise of my argument, if I believe both naturalism and evolution, I have a defeater for my intuitive assumption that my cognitive faculties are reliable. If I have a defeater for that belief, however, then I have a defeater for any belief I take to be produced by my cognitive faculties." End quote. In his 1871 landmark publication, The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin did his best to demonstrate how the cognitive faculties of human beings not only were derived from animals, but that animals possessed many of the same mental characteristics of human beings. Darwin says, quote, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not kind. We have seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even sometimes in a well-developed condition in the lower animals." End quote. The gist of Darwin's idea is that our cognition and mental capabilities of thinking, of our logic, reason, contemplation powers, may very well be merely derivative characteristics inherited from the lower animals. But this idea caused Darwin a bit of doubt. He noted in a private letter to William Graham in 1881, 10 years after the publication of The Descent of Man, quote, With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" End quote. In short, if naturalism is true and Darwin is correct, then we have no good reason to trust our cognitive faculties. And as C.S. Lewis noted in his classic essay Miracles, quote, "Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. Of course, it is possible to suppose that when all the atoms of the universe got into a certain relation, which they were bound to get into sooner or later, they would give rise to a universal consciousness. And it might have thoughts, and it might cause those thoughts to pass through our minds. But unfortunately, its own thoughts on this supposition would be the product of non-rational causes, and therefore, by the rule which we use daily, they would have no validity. The cosmic mind would be, just as much as our own minds, the product of mindless nature." End quote. The most common naturalistic explanations for Jesus rising from the dead include the possibility that Jesus' body was stolen and hidden away somewhere, the possibility that Jesus' disciples were experiencing some sort of grief hallucination, the possibility that Jesus' resurrection was simply a redacted mythology of other dying and rising God stories from the ancient world, and the possibility that Jesus never really did die, that he swooned, fainted, or passed out for 3 days. While justice cannot be done here to Gary's extensive research compiled in Volume 2 pertaining to each of these objections, he does offer 5 summarized points related to these and other naturalistic objections to the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. They can be found toward the end of Volume 2 on pages 757 through 769. Quote, "Reason 1. The skeptical backdrop against miracles provided by David Hume fails to provide good cover for the prospect of rejecting miracles. Reason 2. Each natural hypothesis, especially aimed at Jesus' resurrection, is refuted by multiple reasons taken from the list of minimal historical facts and the data that confirm them. Reason 3. None of the major natural alternative theses cover all the minimal data. So, more than one theory is probably necessary. Reason 4. 19th century German liberal scholars indicated many of the weaknesses in each of the natural theses by refuting individually each hypothesis on a piecemeal basis. Reason 5. In contrast, most 20th century critical scholars rejected wholesale the naturalistic theories." End quote. Gary thus argues that between naturalistic hypotheses having little or no evidentiary data within liberal scholarship on the resurrection today, coupled with skeptics failing to establish the truth of naturalism by empirical means, and by not being able to establish the trustworthiness of their own cognitive faculties, arguments against the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead simply fall flat. In Gary's baseball analogy, then, they don't even get to first base.
Smith got a piece of it. Berrien grabbed behind him, back foot to second. On to first, a double play. Incredible.
He's getting a round of applause from the folks here in Chicago.
You're a naturalist, right? Or you're a materialist. And I bet you the point you're trying to make is all supernatural arguments are faulty. Let me ask you your view. How do you prove naturalism's true? Until you can show me that your worldview is true, and you trot out Marian apparitions, and then you say there are no such thing as Marian apparitions because you're a naturalist, show me your naturalism is true. Let me cite right here on my shelf, a few feet away from me, famous atheist Bertrand Russell, who says, "You're a theist if you believe in God and an afterlife." Okay. What if I can show you arguments for God? Okay, we can talk about them, and he did. I can show you arguments for an afterlife, near-death experiences. I think they're not good arguments. But how do you disprove the arguments for God, and how do you disprove the arguments for an afterlife? Russell said, I can't do it. I can't prove God doesn't exist, and presumably he means he can't prove there's not a naturalist. This is the kind of thing about this argument, the first, second, third base thing, that really burns me. If you can't prove naturalism, how dare you take naturalism or materialism and juxtapose it against Christians? You cannot prove naturalism or the lack of an afterlife.
Here, Gary gave me an example of the prevalence of naturalism in the academic world. He pulled a book off of his shelf, published by Harvard University Press, on the subject of prayer.
All they're saying is, give me your theory. And you give a Christian theory about whatever. Jesus was a miracle worker. We have double-blind prayer experiments today written up in medical journals. Whatever I tell you, the comeback is false, 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 false. We don't see those things today. Wait a minute. I have cases where those things are true. Daniel, let me pull a book here. This book, Candy Gunther Brown, it's called Testing Prayer. She takes a group of scientists and prayers, people who pray. If I remember the story correctly, she goes to Africa. Now, she's a PhD from Harvard. Last time I heard, a professor of religion at University of Indiana. Good school. And a degree. Good school, Harvard. She takes a group to Africa. She takes a group to South America. They do medical checkups, prayer, and they start giving statistics on how many changed based on the data they have right there. Here's what kills me about this book. It's called Testing Prayer. She's got a PhD from Harvard. The book is published by Harvard University Press. And on the back, there's two recommendations, one a present and one a former professor of Harvard Medical School. All right, without me giving any other data, I say it's a big book, there's over 300 pages here. There's got to be something here. Doesn't this count for data? No, because it's a supernatural. Oh, and what are you wiping this out with? My view, which is naturalism. And your evidence is, I don't need anybody. Everybody knows those things don't happen. What are your data again? Well, I don't have an argument to give you. I just know any wise person doesn't think that's true. Now we're going back to David Hume. And it just kills me that religious people in general, Christians in particular, can give you data for things going on. Intelligent design, fine-tuning, near-death experiences, just about the world. You don't have to be a Buddhist. You don't have to be a Christian. There's things about the world that show that the naturalistic worldview is false. Nope. The assumption is true. And I'm saying it's a horrible backdrop from which to launch your critique when you don't have any data to prove your opinion.
Again, Gary's argument here is that the foundations of naturalism are really the main issue. Naturalism by itself gives us no reason to trust our cognitive faculties. Our abilities to think, reason, and contemplate are just the outcome of an atomistic reductionism, the sum total of atoms in the void. No one is right or wrong, objectively speaking. It is all simply a matter of different arrangements of one's neural chemicals. So then, naturalism itself is what needs to be addressed before we can even begin conversations about objections to the resurrection. Here, Gary made the analogy of naturalism's faulty epistemological assumptions to the feat of iron and clay in the statue of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's dream. With a faulty foundation, the entire edifice of naturalistic hypotheses is jeopardized.
Daniel, this has been an interesting discussion. I mean, I've done 300-ish interviews on my YouTube site, and whenever I do natural theories, it's usually this theory, what's wrong? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And what about this one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on. And I'm giving all these refutations. We didn't do that. And I just realized as we were finishing here, we were talking more about the foundations of these theories than we are the theories themselves. And I talked about you got to get the first before second, you got to get the second before third, so on. There's steps beforehand, and these theories are, hey, mixing my metaphors, they're fumbling the ball before they get to the point. Well, the theories we've talking about, it seems to me it's similar to that statue. We hear the dream in Daniel chapter 2. What was it? The statue where it's got all these major metals and everything, but the feet are half clay and half iron. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to use a baseball bat, keep up with the sports illustrations. I wouldn't want to use a baseball bat that's half iron and half clay. It wouldn't work. These things don't stick together. And if the statue is standing on feet that's part iron, part clay, I'll bet you that statue is not going to stand up long. And so what we were doing today was, I didn't realize it till just now, but I think what we were doing is we weren't talking about the theories per se. We were talking about the bad foundations on which the theories are based. And if you see a grizzly bear and thinks it's Sasquatch, if you can't get it right at the base, oh no, look at the footprints. That's not Sasquatch. Call the biologist, it's a grizzly bear. All right, the foundations are wrong. We were talking about the foundations of the naturalistic theories. And I think if they're faulty, we haven't even gone up the edifice. We haven't talked about what's wrong with the 12th floor, the statue's head. The feet are bad. It's not going to be standing up long.
So it reminds me of there's a tower in San Francisco called the Millennium Tower, and I think it's still occupied, but it's leaning, Gary, 29 inches over the corner of Mission Street and Fremont Street in a northwest corner of the building. And now engineers last fall were saying that the center is sinking, but it's like if you lived in San Francisco, an earthquake-prone region, are you going to want to rent an apartment on the 12th floor of the Millennium Tower if you know the foundations are weak? That's going to make occupancy rather questionable for the long term. And I think that's kind of what we were getting at today, that naturalism is a bad foundation from the beginning. And even though engineers in San Francisco have tried to upgrade the foundation, you're not going to convince a lot of potential buyers that it's safe, especially in an earthquake-prone city like San Francisco. So I think I'm appreciative of you addressing that question.
Well, that's a great point. And, you started with naturalism like we did. If the naturalism is mistaken, everything's wrong. But we were going further up the building, to use your illustration. We were saying, what's the difference between hallucination, illusion, and delusion? If you mix and match those, you're going to have, what's that game where the kids play with the adults play too, where you have to pull the little things out and you don't want the building to collapse?
Oh, yeah, Jenga blocks.
Yeah. If we were going at the bottom saying the bottom is faulty, but if up above they're mixing illusions, delusions, and hallucination, then you got something on the 5th floor wrong. And then if they have the photograph wrong and it's a grizzly bear, you're going to get these things wrong. In the book, I pretty much go after and say, here's 10 reasons, here's 5 reasons, here's all this. We didn't get there because if the foundation's faulty, I think what we showed was the thing never gets off the ground.
Apologetics Profile is a production of Watchman Fellowship, Incorporated, Arlington, Texas. For more information on apologetics, cults, world religions, and other non-Christian ideologies and practices, visit watchman.org today. That's watchman.org.